Well, this is Dan Markel. He's the victim in this case. A son, a brother, a colleague, a mentor, a professor, a friend, but most of all, a father, an Abba, a dad, a dedicated and loving father whose downfall was brought about by the fact that his number one priority was maximizing his time with those little boys in the wake of a bitter divorce from their mother. Defense called witnesses to come in here and give you an expert opinion that his divorce and the subsequent litigation was not contentious. Not contentious to whom? It was contentious to Dan Markel. It was contentious to Wendi Adelson. And it was contentious to this defendant. And then after telling you what a great guy Dan Markel was in opening statements, they called witnesses to tell you what a pain in the butt he was. And he was a pain in the butt to those people, those awful lawyers that can't even admit that divorces are emotionally charged. He was a pain in their butts. He was a pain in Wendy's butt, and he was a pain in Donna's butt. Why? Because this was his life we were talking about. Dan Markel was not a file on some lawyer's desk. He was a real person who cared passionately about every scrap of paper in that divorce file. He wasn't some bumbling idiot. He was a Harvard-educated law professor. And yeah, he was making it as difficult as possible for this defendant to get her non-negotiable, which just also happened to be Dan Markel's non-negotiable, those two little boys. You have learned about this conspiracy and how it has unraveled over the last 11 years since Dan Markel's death. The defendants in this case have all attempted to point fingers at each other. They have argued that the state's theory is right. It's right. You got it right with everybody except for me. I didn't do it. Garcia's defense was that Charlie went directly to Rivera to arrange the hit on Dan Markel. Kathryn Magbanua testified in her trial and said she had no knowledge of this murder. Charlie must have gone around her directly to Garcia. In Charlie's trial, he said Magbanua, Garcia, and Rivera all got together to kill Dan Markel without any direction from any Adelson family member. Each defendant characterized himself or herself as another victim in this case. A victim in this situation, a victim of their co-defendants, setting them up, or the appearance of evidence that seemed to implicate them but wasn't what it appeared to be. But despite their efforts to insulate themselves and to distance themselves from their co-conspirators, they made enough mistakes to get themselves caught and held accountable for their respective roles in this conspiracy. And today is Donna Adelson's turn. Despite their efforts to play victims, Dan Markel is still the only victim in this case. And the only thing he was guilty of was fighting like hell for those little boys. And he lost. He lost everything. This is what he looked like before. This defendant conspired to hire a hitman to have him killed, and this is what he looked like after. The evidence has shown that on July 18th, 2014, this brilliant, accomplished, beloved man was gunned down in cold blood in his own garage. And this horrific death ultimately set the police down two separate paths, following the two most promising leads that they had. The first lead was to chase down that Prius that, thank God, Mr. Geiger caught a glimpse of pulling out of the driveway that morning. And the second path was to ask, as we would with any murder investigation, who had a motive to want him dead? And within 1 hour of the shooting, well before Professor Markel had even been pronounced dead, this path was already pointing to the defendant when Wendi Adelson revealed to officers that her parents had more reason to dislike her ex than anyone else. And what offense had Mr. Markel committed against Donna Adelson and her family, refusing to let his children be taken away from him? Objecting to her telling his kids that he's stupid? The evidence has shown that Donna Adelson was all about psychological warfare, and when all else failed, she was willing to do whatever it took to accomplish her non-negotiable, to get a win. In order for you to render a verdict of guilty, the state must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that these crimes were committed and that this defendant is the person who committed the crimes, or in this case, one of the persons who committed the crimes. It is undisputed that these crimes were committed. This was a first-degree murder. No doubt about that. But who did it? The only issue left is identification, or what we call ID. The defense told you in openings, motive doesn't really matter. Don't pay attention to all the motive. Don't pay attention to all the emails. But motive can be compelling proof of who done it. Identification. And thus, critical to your determination of the defendant as one of the persons that committed this crime. Despite some of the testimony that you heard, it is clear that the divorce between Wendi and Dan was contentious. Except the person who cared most about Wendi's divorce, and relocation specifically, wasn't Wendi. It was her mother. Charlie Adelson solicited Kathryn McBanoa to kill Dan Markel, but why? Who solicited Charlie? Because Charlie didn't care about the Adelson family getting a win against Dan Markel. He didn't care about relocation. He didn't care about Wendi's divorce. He cared about go-karts and jet skis and pretty girls. But he also cared about getting things done for the number one woman in his life, and that was his mother. She managed Charlie's life for him, and in return, he solved problems for her. That pattern is seen throughout this case. He talks to Wendi on the defendant's behalf to get her to pull the plug on the Tallahassee house, to date Dave and invite him to Mother's Day, to pursue a medical malpractice job, even though that's not even her area of the law. And on and on and on. She micromanaged Wendi's life. Charlie knows how to manage Wendi in a way that Donna can't, or knows how to talk to her in a way that Donna can't. And Wendi needs their help, right? Because according to them, she doesn't even have enough of a brain in her head to run her own life without their help. Donna decides what's best for everyone, and if she runs into any problems making that happen, Charlie is her go-to guy to get it done. He is the problem solver. And what was the biggest problem that Donna Adelson had in 2014? Dan Markel. Wendi filed her petition for divorce on September 10th of 2012, and the defendant was right in the middle of it. In the fall of 2012, the defendant told her son, Rob Adelson, that she had been in Tallahassee for several months, renting a new place for Wendi. She used her own maiden name to do that, to disguise the identity of who was renting it, arranging for movers, moving money around, and getting things set up for Wendi to leave Dan. Then Wendi calls Dan Markel and delivers the news that she's leaving him. How does she do it? She tells him she and the boys are moving out of the marital home, and the defendant gleefully, that was Rob's word, reported to Rob, her son, that she and Wendi strategically planned to deliver that news to Mr. Markel so that he would get this bomb dropped on him right as he's about to take the stage to deliver this lecture. According to Mr. Markel in one of his filings, quote, while the husband was away on a short business trip, the wife left the husband in the marital home, taking with her the children's furniture, clothing, toys, and whatever assets, both marital and non-marital, she desired. The evidence has shown that from the start, this defendant was very involved in managing Wendi's divorce. In October of 2012, defendant writes an email entitled, "Things to discuss at your mediation to make sure you have in writing for a settlement," in which she refers to Wendi as a hostage and a prisoner in Tallahassee. That's what she believed. The email also includes the suggestion that Wendi pursue a restraining order against Dan Markel, that Wendi should go for 100% full custody of those two kids and relocation, and the threat of this conversion to Christianity. Quote, "If he leaves you in Tallahassee, the children will not be attending Hebrew day school. That's not a threat, just a warning." A warning that her friend, Ms. Cunningham, on the stand dismissed. Oh, that was just a foolish thing to say, right? But the characterization of these threats as, just something that was a one-off heat of passion thing has been completely destroyed by the evidence in this case, because she repeats it. She plans it with a lot of specificity. Wendi even admitted that her mom was serious about planning a baptism for these kids to change their religion as a ruse to try to strong-arm Dan Markel into giving up those kids. This is an example of the defendant operating with the emotional subterfuge as described by her daughter, Donna Adelson. Also remember how her son Rob described her. She has rigid and fixed ideas of what she wants. And as long as you comply, things are fine. But when you don't comply, things are not fine. Wendi even admitted that if Dan had relented and moved to South Florida, or at least allowed her to move there, they might have co-parented happily ever after. But Dan did not comply, so things were definitely not fine. The defendant ends this email with, quote, "We will help you in any way possible for you to come here." In October, this defendant drafted language for Wendi's petition to relocate, including allegations that Wendi had been upset about having to live in Tallahassee since 2005, and a mention of putting the boys in a Christian school and on a non-kosher diet. Again, that's not a threat, just a reality. And the suggestion that the boys live in South Florida with Wendi and Dan just fly back and forth to see his kids. He can just come see them every other weekend by airplane. Doesn't that sound like an amicable, equal time sharing that the lawyers for the defense described was going on here? Wendi's lawyer says she had no knowledge of Wendi's mom being involved in her divorce, but the evidence shows she absolutely was. Wendi sends the proposed petition for relocation from her lawyer to the defendant with a note that says, "Here it is, let's edit." And the defendant responds the next day with detailed feedback, including an argument that Dan Markel is incapable of taking care of his own children and that Wendi should seek 100% custody. Arguments which Wendi forwarded to her lawyer as her own. And upon receiving the lawyer's answer, she sends the lawyer's answer back to the defendant. That's in evidence. Defendant's thoughts about Wendi's earning potential and her work environment in Tallahassee. Arguments about she'd be better off with this other job that's higher paying in Miami. And defendant says she's been living in Tallahassee, that she, the defendant, has been living in Tallahassee since the petition was filed to help Wendi with the boys. In January of 2013, the defendant advises Wendi on her amended petition to relocate. And this is where the argument is raised about the job as a major bargaining chip in the divorce. The defendant writes here that Dan needs to know that there's no way in hell Wendi is going to stay at FSU. On January 14th, Wendi files an amended petition with request to relocate, which you can read and see. The petition contains many of the defendant's arguments. She couches this relocation in terms of not only important, but like a matter of life and death. Look at these quotes. "It will create a major negative change in our lives. It will ruin your entire life. The rest of all our lives. Mine, Dad's, and even Charlie's will be affected by how well she can perform and act before July 31st to try to get this relocation thing turned around." Donna has even started pre-screening men for Wendi to date in the Miami area. In February, Dan files his response to Wendi's motion to relocate, alleging Wendi took his stuff when she left. The sole reason for relocation is to be close to her mother and family in South Florida, and that contrary to what Wendi put in her pleading, he was not seeking to leave FSU. He wasn't trying to move. Wendi failed to comply with their Skype agreement, that Wendi exhibited deceitful behavior, made false statements, showed a lack of integrity, and had unclean hands. Those are some pretty nasty words. Maybe not the worst thing that the defense experts ever seen, but pretty nasty. Dan Markel requests sole decision-making authority for these kids regarding education, medical, and religious matters. The defense lawyer witnesses said, oh, that was never going to work. Maybe that's true. But these were concerns that Dan Markel took seriously. There's tons of discussions in evidence in these binders before you, in the pleadings and in the emails about Dan Markel's desire to raise these boys in accordance with his faith and his concerns that his wishes were going to go right out the window as soon as the boys went over to be with Wendi or her mother. And defendant took this matter seriously too. She made it crystal clear in these emails that she had no respect for these boys' fathers' wishes for them regarding religious practices. In this email, defendant says she's sitting at Wendi's kitchen table working on Wendi's response to the filing we just talked about that Dan Markel made. So much for her having no involvement in her daughter's divorce. She says in this email to a friend, all Wendi wants out of this is to relocate to South Florida where she has us and Charlie. Danny is making it very difficult. On March 5th, 2013, defendant sends a long email in response to every paragraph of Dan Markel's arguments against relocation, including that Dan's religious practices are fanatical and dangerous to the boys, and that Dan Markel is psychologically unfit to have custody of his children. It's not sounding very amicable, is it? In opening statements, the defendant's attorney acknowledged that Dan Markel was an intelligent, accomplished professor and a dedicated father, and the state could not agree more. But the evidence has shown that her client didn't agree with that. Donna Adelson repeatedly paints Dan Markel as a self-important idiot who's not fit to care for his own children. On March 6, 2013, Dan Markel sends Wendi an email threatening to take her to court over her failure to cooperate with the Skype thing. That comes up repeatedly. Here he says you've made zero efforts to facilitate that when you or your mother could have easily done so. I don't want conflict or tension. I desperately want peace and joy. Please let that happen, but do not mistake my politeness or desire for cooperation as a lack of firmness. I will not tolerate failures on your part to keep our agreements. They did have a Skype agreement, and she was violating it, and he was furious about it. This email was forwarded by Wendi to this defendant, so she knows about all this stuff.